So there was a strong strategic background to the development of this strategy. And it was first decided that the best way to meet this enormous challenge was to break it into bite-sized chunks. And therefore, there was a phased approach developed. So phase one was really just about making sure that we could build awareness for this new unified global brand. Phase two was about deepening the relationship between the brand and its populace by adding personality and humanity and by reinforcing the communication of excellent customer service. Then there was a phase three, which in the longer term was a focus on wealth management for the mass affluent, for personal customers. Remember those three phases as we go through this. Starting with phase one, there needed to be a really clear structure as to how we would devise this brand strategy. So what we were doing here was, first of all, looking at a pestle. So we were thinking about the competitive context, the external environment, and using all sorts of tools to try to understand what was going on. We were using ethnography, ethnohistography, positivist research, amongst the bank and its competitors and other interested parties. We were using grounded theory to develop strategy and concepts. And we were using phenomenology, in other words, the interaction of strategy with product and communications, to make sure that what we were doing had a basis in science. We used narrative analysis because the stories behind the bank were critically important in understanding its values and what it stood for. We use discourse analysis in order to help us with the language that we use, both amongst customers and amongst staff. As mentioned, the phenomenological stuff and the hermeneutic analyses were really important to try to figure out what was going on for the people who were involved in or affected by this new brand. And grounded theory and thematic analysis helped us to develop these explanatory theories, which were based in fact in history, in current affairs, in culture, to generate the creative strategy. Very briefly, back in 1999, there was a lot going on, but in particular, these headlines. So there was a lot of corporate activity going on. There was a huge amount of development in channel technology. Cash machines were being developed. Phone banking was just starting. There was all this consolidation going on. So there was a massive amount of competition, and the competition was coming from sources outside traditional banks. Suddenly you find the post office, building societies, supermarkets offering financial service products. So the products themselves were becoming vanilla. I mentioned that the bank had a strategic focus on the mass affluent for this wealth management idea, but of course so did every other major bank in the world. So it was a very competitive arena within which to play, both on a local level and on a global level. The major global competitors were these 6 players. So we looked at them in some detail. We also looked at the major local competitors in each market. It would take ages to go through all of those with you, but these will crop up again. So looking at their global positionings, they were actually very similar. Citigroup was talking about basically being a big global bank. Bank America had just been involved in a merger, and so they were talking about that. Chase Manhattan and Deutsche were just talking about partnership with you, the customer, and ABN and UBS were slightly different, one talking about their expertise and the other talking about how products are tailor-made for you. The top 4 were largely focusing their communications around their retail business, whereas the bottom 2 were largely focusing around investment banking. And don't forget, of course, there were lots more brands in every country, local brands. There was little differentiation amongst these things. We put together a film at the time which took elements from all of those banks and just strung them together into one commercial. And in them you saw people wearing ties, you saw lots of handshakes, you saw bankers holding babies, all sorts of cliches as you would expect. And none of them were ownable. None of them were tied to any particular brand. You could change the logo at the end and nobody would notice. Although we were looking at all of these things, we realized that they didn't have any unique truths. They didn't have any particular end lines that people were interested in or remembered. That was true of the global competitors and, broadly speaking, of most local competitors. You might recognize the idea of a brand diamond, as was espoused by Keller, but we used this tool, slightly modified, to analyze the positioning of all of the major competitors. And as an example, we'll look at Citibank here. So the way we used the brand diamond was to look at these 6 dimensions: culture, staff image, consumer image, the relationship with the consumer, the physical attributes, and the personality of the brand. So we went through all of this. And if we look at the right-hand side first, Citibank, very much a culture of Americanism, chest beating. It's all about the now and the big me, the big I am. The staff image, as a consequence of that, was they like to think of themselves as the best and fiercely competitive, very individualistic, usually fighting with themselves. The consumers were those who wanted to mirror that sort of aggressive competitiveness. They wanted to appear successful. They were very proud to flash their Citi card. So the relationship they wanted with the brand was all about status and innovation. Physically, big, global, a big range of products. And their personality was very dynamic, very leading, very aggressive. And whether they could actually deliver that stuff in product terms is a different story. Compare and contrast with HSBC on the left-hand side, where the culture was much more multicultural and much more about the long term rather than just today. Their staff image was all about being dedicated and working together. So the consumers who are interested in that are those who are interested in a much more secure, dependable, longer-term relationship, built on trust and reassurance. Identical in terms of physical attributes, but the personality of HSBC was much more considered, unassuming, and shrewd. So if we're going to try and put something in the middle of those diamonds, what is it going to be? Well, for Citi, we paraphrase that down to one word, which was achievement. For HSBC, that's the word we were looking for. What was it going to be? As a summary of the competitive context, the competition was really fierce, and there was no sign of that diminishing. But it was fierce in terms of dollars, not necessarily in terms of differentiation. There weren't many ownable platforms. Most of the brands were very bland in terms of their positioning. But there was the emergence over the horizon of the dot-coms, as they were starting to pose a much more serious competitive threat to the global brands. What was clear from all of that was that there was a need, rather than just beating our chests, to put the customer at the center of this new brand. That was what was missing from all of the competitive work. And how many times have you been taught that? Please don't forget it. We conducted an audit of the HSBC organization around the world. Its customers, its staff, its directors, its managers, its tellers, and journalists and regulators and commentators and floor sweepers and all sorts of people. And we wanted to do that looking at the culture of the organization, looking at its personality, looking at the nature of its staff, looking at the kind of customers and the kind of relationship. In other words, to populate the brand diamond that we'd seen before. Again, lots of research tools here and just lots of old-fashioned conversations as well, around 50 countries in the world. And this is where we started. Again, going back to the chairman, Sir John Bond, who said the essence of the HSBC brand is integrity, trust, and excellent customer service. But in order for that to be the essence, we've got to get customers to believe it. We've got to get staff to deliver it. And that's a really tricky challenge. And therefore, it was as important to have a staff campaign to explain this as it was going to be to have a consumer-facing campaign. If your people don't know what's going on and can't both explain it and deliver it to customers, your brand doesn't have a hope. I'm skimming over this because it was a really detailed, painstaking exercise. However, the values that HSBC had were these: quiet confidence, an unassuming nature. Don't forget this is back in the year 1998-99. Things I think have changed a lot since then. But they were decent and considered and responsive, and they were prudent and shrewd and stoic or conservative. Internally, they were very different from most of their competitors. They were global and multicultural, which is an interesting paradox, whereas most of the local players were local and parochial, and even banks like Citi were pretty much local because they're all about being American. They're interested in doing stuff rather than talking about it. They're interested in networking rather than competing with themselves. They're interested in the long term, both for themselves and for their customers. And interestingly, they were very self-reliant. They had never used a consultant until my advertising agency got involved. Next, we set about defining this global brand positioning using all the work that we'd done looking externally and internally. Very, very simplified, the path to success was illustrated like this. So in the first instance, the customer was put at the forefront, and it was really important to offer superior customer service than what they were used to with the old brand. So that was where this virtuous circle started. The service embodied elements of dealing with them accurately and on time and to their satisfaction, providing them the particular aspects of value that they look for and they're looking for at that minute from that product or service, thereby proving understanding of and affinity with their needs. This in turn would engender loyalty from those customers. And of course, as we all know, it's much more cost effective to keep current customers than to find new ones. By doing it right, customers will be happy, and if they're happy, the chances are we'll generate increased staff satisfaction. And that improves their attitude and their performance, and of course, it's more cost effective. And if that happens, we will develop increased investor loyalty, which drives up the share price. And that allows us to invest more in customer value. So the circle spins around. We concluded that the first iteration of a central brand value for HSBC was one word. You might recognize the red hexagon for the brand, which is quite similar in shape to the brand diamond that we looked at before. So here it is. No word in the middle, but the word that we came up with was responsible. Now that sounds a bit boring. However, by articulating it to our customers and building awareness of the new brand, we did build their belief in the trustworthiness and integrity of the brand. By behaving in a responsible manner, we would continue to improve on customer service, striving to achieve excellence. But first, of course, we had to explain who we are. A paradox being one of the biggest banks in the world, and yet brand new. So for the first time, HSBC would run exactly the same campaign around the world. And of course, many people said it can't be done because of local market requirements and because of the difficulty of making a single brand travel across cultures. The same brand values can mean different things in different places if you're not very careful. We wanted HSBC to represent responsibility. In the UK, this would mean that we won't rip you off with hidden costs. However, in Brazil, responsibility might mean that the bank won't go bust and lose your money overnight. We wanted our customers to take out these key words from John Bond: trust, integrity, and excellent customer service. You may think that things like trust and integrity are table stakes if you want to be a bank. That's true in developed countries, but it's still a really important requirement for a new brand and for a bank in many developing countries. How did we go about it? Again, I'm going to pause here so you can think what we might have done.